goes there?
The Delapore Media Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Delapore Media Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Wall, and in this episode I will examine the vampire as a creature of folklore and popular culture, as well as a tool for storytelling in horror TTRPGs. Please enjoy. So I'm going to start with a book that is considered a masterstroke in the study of vampire legends and vampire folklore. And this is Paul Barber's Vampires, Burial, and Death. It was written in 1988. It takes a variety of first-hand written accounts from history and synthesizes them in a way where you actually end up with a theory on the origin of the vampire legend, which is not something you see in a lot of contemporary folklore, but Barber pulls it off. And he pulls it off using two pieces of key evidence. The first is, well, a creature of supernatural origin that makes its face known, at least to some degree, in legends across Eastern and Southern Europe. This creature has a variety of names, and where Barber starts to really discuss it is with a story called The Vrikolakis of Mykonos. Now, this is a story from the island of Mykonos from 1701 from a scholar of the day called Piton de Tourfort. And this individual witnessed the exhumation, the dissection, and ultimately the destruction of a corpse understood by the locals to be a Vrikolakis. Now, a Vrikolakis is a creature that has kind of a plastic definition. There's no specifics. We don't get to specifics on the vampire until later, and you'll see why soon. But for now, with the Vrikolakis, the key features are that it has something to do with death, and it harms people, and it disrupts daily life in a rural medieval locality. And when it comes to the Vrikolakis, I mean, this is a Greek word. However, it does have some Bulgarian roots, and you can find other examples of words similar to it all across the Balkan region of Eastern Europe. Words like Vordulak or Varkolak, they mean the same thing. This thing that has something to do with death that disrupts life and causes harm to people. But that's about the only solid definition you have. Beyond that, the means by which it causes harm are many and varied. Barber actually utilizes another scholar's work to discuss this further. Elwood Trigg, who wrote a discussion of Romany beliefs in the 1970s, mentions vampires, and it turns out they actually have a wide variety of ways to harm people. Appearing most often to those whom he considers his enemies, he may seek to kill them by sucking their blood, eating parts of their bodies, doing other violence to them, or simply causing them such terror that they die. Short of this, they have been known to cause the living physical harm by beating them and destroying their property, They have been known also to disturb families by causing loud noises, setting fires, turning over caravans, breaking dishes, and killing domestic animals by choking them to death. So, by our modern definitions as consumers of fiction and film and games and all of that, the thing that Trigg is describing could be any number of supernatural entities. It could be a vampire, sure. I mean, there's talk of drinking blood in some cases. But it could also be a witch. I mean, the discussion of harming livestock and of setting fire to houses, creating noise at night. I mean, that's a very kind of witch approach to things in our modern understanding of the supernatural. At the same time, de Tourneforth also considers the Vricolagus that he observed to be a kind of loup-garou. So this is moving us in the direction of French werewolf legends. So what is this thing? You know, it's not a vampire by our terms. It could be a werewolf, it could be a witch, it could be a revenant, it could be a ghost. And the thing we have to keep in mind here is that we're talking about the belief needs, the cultural needs of medieval peasant communities living in the wilderness, living a rural life in the wilderness. And in reality, you don't have to be too specific in that set of circumstances. You need to be able to point to something that's creating the situation, and you need to be able to resolve it. But beyond that, giving it specific abilities, powers, a backstory, that's not really something that's necessary. And Barber points out that the reason that we have the distinction today between vampires and werewolves doesn't really have anything to do with medieval peasantry who were experiencing these things as up-close and personal legends. Rather, it has to do with the fact that we put Lon Chaney on one screen and we put Bela Lugosi on the other screen, and we said that guy's a werewolf and that guy's a vampire. And so the modern distinction for this supernatural entity is a modern invention. Now, the second pillar of evidence associated with Barber's vampire theory is quite a bit more complex and rather gory. So listener discretion advised as we move forward here. Because we're going to talk about the mechanics of death, and specifically the up-close and personal nature of those mechanics as experienced by medieval and late medieval peasants. For us nowadays, death lies further and further behind a curtain. We've been making it this way for the last almost 200 years. And the people that we know that die today, they die in hospital or they die in hospice care. There's a specific place where they die that keeps them out of public life, keeps them from disrupting our public existence. And by the time we see them after death, the mortician has done their work, or the crematorium has done its work, and we have human remains that are aesthetically pleasing and viewable by family and friends and well-wishers without getting into the nitty-gritty gory details of what happens in death and decay. We might occasionally slip and see what's behind the curtain where death is concerned. Dramatic accidents, sudden death, death at home. We might catch a glimpse of the visual, but by and large, our society has drawn a cloak around the experience of death that simply wasn't there for peasants from the medieval and Renaissance eras, and even into the Enlightenment. So you look at the situation in a medieval village. Let's say, you're in the Balkans, it's winter, you're having a winter feast, a celebration of some sort, and you come upon Grandpa, and he has enjoyed his meal and enjoyed his wine, and he has kicked off. He has bought the farm. Well, what happens? Obviously, the feast continues on. It has to. But more importantly, what do we do with this dead person in our midst? Once we know he's dead, we have to dispose of him somehow. There's no morticians around or anything like that to do the work for us, really. So we're doing it as a family. But we only really have hand tools to dig a grave. And it's winter. And the ground is frozen. And were we to go out and try and dig a very scant grave for Grandpa, we know that there are dozens, if not hundreds of eyes watching us from the woods, waiting to get a tasty meal in the form of the unmoving Grandpa that will satisfy their needs as their stomachs go hungry in the winter, because, everyone's struggling who doesn't farm, and animals definitely can't do that. So they'll grab anything at this point. But we also can't keep Grandpa in the house. That's not going to work either. He's not exactly a good conversationalist anymore. He's a little stiff. He takes up space. And plus, we know if we keep him in a warm place, he will start to smell. And that's going to be unpleasant for everyone. So what do you do? Wrap him in a blanket and put him in the barn? Maybe. But you're going to want to keep a close eye on him, because just like with the freshly dug shallow grave, if we put Grandpa in the barn and don't watch him for a month, we're going to come back to find him covered in rats and bugs and other things. Even the cold can't keep out the decay process. It can't keep scavengers out, certainly. And as part of this experience of, holding on to Grandpa until the spring thaw, we're going to notice some things. We're going to have to check in on him. So we're going to notice some processes occur. These processes are very natural. They happen to everything that dies. And really, the way I think about it for human beings, we are bags of meat that run on circulating fluids. We're kind of like clocks that our gears are fluid. And when we die, those gears stop turning. Those fluids stop moving. And they change us as they stop moving. And Barber enlists the assistance of a forensic pathologist to explain just how this happens. The blood, after death, gravitates into the capillaries of the dependent parts to impart a pinkish-purple discoloration to the skin called hypostasis. If the body is laid supine, the back of the body becomes discolored. It does not appear in those parts of the body in actual contact with the surface upon which the body rests. For example, upon the back of the shoulders, the buttocks, and the back of the calves. The weight of the body is sufficient to close the capillaries in these areas and prevent them from filling with blood. If the body has been laying face downwards, hypostasis affects the front of the body, or, in bodies which are suspended, as in hanging, hypostasis first appears in the lower limbs. Hypostasis becomes apparent about half an hour after death, but it is not complete until some 6 to 8 hours have elapsed. During this time, it is possible to change its distribution by altering the position of the body, but thereafter the discoloration is usually permanent because the blood has coagulated. Although pink at first, the color rapidly darkens. When fully developed, hypostasis is dark purple in color due to the fact that the blood is no longer oxygenated. C.J. Poulsen, The Scientific Aspects of Forensic Medicine. Now, presumably we get Grandpa into the ground by the spring thaw. He's been cold over the winter, so we didn't see him decay or anything like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's over. Because, I mean, remember, we're medieval or Renaissance or even Enlightenment era peasants here. So, I mean, we're at the mercy of the elements out here in a rural environment. And so that means things like floods, things like desperate starving animals who are willing to dig deep, and also thieves and robbers might end up interfering with our attempt to lay Grandpa to rest. So what happens? A flood comes along, it floods the valley where we are, it causes the water table to rise, and oops, suddenly Grandpa in his box, or maybe not even in his box, maybe in his shroud, just kind of pops out of the ground. Maybe alternatively, an animal comes along and decides to dig deep and pull up that tasty corpse that's rotting in the ground. And suddenly, there's Grandpa sitting up in his grave, might be missing half his face and an arm, but he's there. Or, alternatively, people who are without homes of their own, who are desperate, who might consider us enemies, who don't really care for the sacredness of Grandpa's grave, come along and dig him up looking for grave goods. And, there's suddenly Grandpa out of the grave, lying on his stomach, and all his jewelry and other important grave goods are missing. So, yeah, each of these circumstances puts us in an odd position if we are peasants from a pre-modern era. Because even though we're peasants, we have a degree of religious knowledge. And that has told us that God treats us differently from the animals. God considers our corpses to be sacred and things that will be resurrected, where the animals, not so much. So we go to bed one night, and whether by elements, by animals, or by nefarious outlaws, Grandpa ends up out of his grave, that's going to set us on edge because something's not right with God at that point. And that kind of triggers supernatural belief. Moreover, if Grandpa's been in the ground 3 or 4 weeks, or maybe, even a couple of months, we're going to notice he doesn't quite look the same as he did when we buried him. And again, Barber has an excellent way of bringing in the experts to discuss the facts of human putrefaction. Glaister and Rentoul list the following external signs of putrefaction. Greenish coloration over the right iliac fossa, the depression at the lowest part of the small intestine. Extension of greenish color over the whole of the abdomen and other parts of the body. Discoloration and swelling of the face. Swelling and discoloration of the scrotum or of the vulva. Distension of the abdomen with gases. brownish coloration on the surface veins, giving an arborescent pattern on the skin, development of bullae, blisters, of varying size on the surfaces, bursting of bullae, and denudation of large irregular surfaces due to shedding of epidermis. Escape of blood-stained fluid from the mouth and nostrils. Liquefaction of the eyeballs. Increasing discoloration of the body generally, and greater and more progressive abdominal distension. Presence of maggots. Shedding of the nails and loosening of the hair. Facial features unrecognizable. Conversion of tissues into semi-liquid mass. Bursting open of the abdominal and thoracic cavities. Progressive dissolution of the body. So as we might imagine, depending on how long Grandpa has been in the ground, he could look very different coming out the other side. He might have teeth more visible, his lips kind of pulled back. He might have blood leaking from his mouth or nose, or at least a blood-colored fluid. He might have long fingernails as the skin around them has retracted. His hair might have fallen off, leaving him balder than he was previously. His skin could have changed color. And, depending on where gases are trapped, he might have a very prodigious swollen stomach, looking like, he did maybe that night at that feast where he died. And so as a result, we, being pre-modern peasants, utilize what Levi-Strauss calls bricolage to solve this problem. Bricolage is actually an architectural term that Levi-Strauss borrowed, but Levi-Strauss put this idea out there to help explain the fact that human beings are very bad with a knowledge gap. If there's a piece of missing information, human beings will fill it in. They will fill it in with whatever is available. And that's the architecture bricolage. The architectural definition is building with whatever you have around you. Building with the immediate materials to hand. Doesn't matter if it's kind of a mishmash of ideas. And so that's what we end up getting. Because, not only could we have a situation where, Grandpa pops out of the ground and looks like he has a full belly and blood coming out of his nose. But then on top of that, we might have other things happen, other coincidences, other occurrences that add to the available knowledge that we can cobble together an explanation from. Let's go back to the various reasons that Grandpa might have popped up out of the ground. The flood, in addition to unburying Grandpa, might have caused sickness in our village, maybe among children and the like. People who are particularly vulnerable to illness, wet, cold, that sort of thing. Sickness abounds. And also, this man has popped out of his grave. We might get a situation where wild animals have carried off one or more people, or pets, or the like. And then there's this man who's also popped out of his grave and looks like he has a very full belly, the kind of belly you would get from eating a small child. And then maybe those same bandits who dug up the grave and stole all of Grandpa's jewelry and grave goods, maybe they caused a ruckus that scared somebody nearby. Maybe they turned over somebody's wagon. Maybe they set somebody's house on fire. All these coincidences could work to form an explanation whereby we start to see Grandpa as some sort of unliving thing that has burst forth from the grave and caused havoc within the village. And let's take it even a step further, because, I mean, this doesn't just have to happen to Grandpa, a beloved relative. What if it happened to, let's say, old Pavel, the drunken lecher who is always yelling at women and scaring children, and is generally an abusive cuss that nobody likes. Let's say he dies and then is unburied by one or more forces of nature or political reality. Would we start to maybe look at that situation a bit differently? Would it be easier for us to suggest that the old drunken lech had become a monster after death? Taking a step further, what if it was a foreigner in our village who died? What if it was an enemy, or somebody who was partly descended from one of our traditional enemies? We can quickly see how these coincidences can get out of hand when death is such a public and obvious thing, but the mechanisms of death remain, at least their reasons for existing, remain elusive. So let's talk about the vampire's journey through popular culture. At a certain point, the vampire is no longer just Barber's supernatural folklore creature, but an entity that breaks out onto the pages of books, onto stage, and onto screen, and makes its presence known in the wider world. And I want to explore why this happens, as well as how it happens. So first, to get a sense of why, we need to consider that the vampire is a very stretchy, very plastic symbol that can be wrapped around almost anything. And particularly, symbols are useful when you don't have language immediately available to explain a concept, or work your way through understanding something that's difficult, maybe a point of cognitive dissonance in culture. And so maybe one of the first examples we can see with the vampire taking on this role of helping to explain or discuss the untellable things in culture is with the novel Dracula. I'm a firm believer, and there are a lot of other people who are firm believers, that Dracula isn't just a story that Bram Stoker wrote. It was Bram Stoker attempting to reconcile ideas about Victorian moral culture and the realities of human life, particularly sex and sexuality, as well as disease. Syphilis was a rampant issue in Stoker's time. And it was frightening. It created a lot of anxiety. And when there's anxiety, people need a way to communicate that anxiety. They need to be able to feel and experience that anxiety. And when it came to a sexually transmitted illness in Victorian times, there was no real way to discuss that politely. So Stoker turns to symbolism as a means of resolving the quandary. He needs to talk about the fact that there is this deadly illness that is transmitted sexually that creates patterns of long suffering and misery in the people who have it, as well as the people who are around those who have it. Syphilis is a death sentence at this time, and a nasty one at that, a torturous death sentence, a death sentence that strips one of not only their dignity, but their mental capacity. And as they go in the throes of agony, people are forced to watch. And not only is there kind of the component of the disease itself, but, I mean, say you're in a situation where you're in a monogamous marriage and suddenly your spouse contracts syphilis. Well, obviously, I mean, if it's the Victorian era, they're going to be reticent to admit to sexual misdeeds. And then on top of that, they're going to suffer this violent, horrible death in front of you, and as the spouse, you're expected to be there with them. So Dracula becomes this way of coping with the untellable elements of sexually transmitted illness. And this just kind of marks the first occasion where the vampire starts to take on a symbolic role in our creative communications with each other. Once film becomes a possibility, the vampire makes his appearance fairly quickly. Initially, he is there to kind of meet the medium where it is and do what needs to be done to get the point across. When you look at a film like the silent Nosferatu, silent film is a strictly visual medium. It requires presence more than anything, and I mean, there aren't any real audio kind of components to it other than musical cues, maybe. So a vampire has to be very obvious. The villain has to be obvious in silent film. This is why the mustache-twirling man who ties the woman to the railroad tracks is a thing. It's because it's very, very obvious in this simplified visual medium. And so Count Orlok of Nosferatu fits right in with this. And he shows us the vampire as the monster and as the corpse-like thing. Orlok is very much a Paul Barber depiction of Vrykalakas. I mean, down to his kind of balding pate and elongated features and pallor. He is a corpse-like creature. But very quickly, the role of cinema changes with the addition of audio components. Once people are able to speak on screen, you can start to tell very different stories, and you can start to tell stories that have a degree of nuance. The Universal Pictures Dracula film makes its appearance in 1931, and it portrays Dracula not as a corpse-like monster, but as a suave, sophisticated, and definitely, I would say, Jewish-coded foreigner. Now, it isn't long after that, say about 5 years, that you get the German-American Bund making its appearance, kind of the American branch of the Nazi movement that leads up to World War II. And so these ideas of the foreigner in the midst of America, transforming the landscape, taking what the white supremacist American conservative considers his property, meaning women. This is something that is in the cultural zeitgeist in 1931. I mean, especially you're looking at after the Great Depression, people are looking for somebody to blame, and oftentimes, as we're seeing now at points of economic turmoil, blame falls on outsiders, on others. And so Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula is portraying him as the sensuous, romantic, suave other, the foreign alien who is invading a Western space. Fast forward a bit past the end of World War II, and we look to Britain. We look to Hammer Films. And we see yet another portrayal of Dracula. The story is good enough that we're seeing it repeated over time. It has meaning. But again, the visual notes of Dracula have changed. We're now seeing Christopher Lee in the role. Christopher Lee, I mean, try as we might, he's as English as they come. And so we're not necessarily looking at the foreigner this time. Instead, we have to kind of look at what's going on around Lee and around Cushing and these kind of Shakespearean-trained actors and what's happening in the film industry at the time and what's happening culturally, which is a sexual revolution that is emerging. And Hammer Films endeavors to kind of play both sides against the middle on this. They like the excitement, they like the titillation, they like the ability to show a naked woman in a vulnerable sexual position on screen because they know that's going to be a draw, that's going to bring in the ticket sales. At the same time, they know that the fact that they're producing these films is going to play toward the anxiety of the conservative elements in society who are worried the sexual revolution is moving too fast or it's moving in a direction they're not expecting. And so Hammer is trying to appeal to both sides, the side that wants titillation and excitement and the side that is concerned about it. Both of these groups could easily end up in seats watching the film. That's the goal. Now, move us forward another 20 or so years, and we reach what I would consider kind of a vampire revival in the 1980s. Now, that could be just kind of my personal context in that the 80s and 90s was when I kind of became aware of popular culture. And so you get films like Lost Boys. Lost Boys, which, I mean, it's not a Dracula story. We're off the beaten path from Dracula, but the elements are still there. And instead, we have this kind of punk rock, pirate radio vampire figure, this youthful vampire at the center of it. I mean, you have Kiefer Sutherland, you have a couple of other kind of young actors who are putting on the vampire role in this and giving a youthful cast to this monster. And so once again, we have the situation of a movie studio kind of playing both sides. Seeing young men in kind of punky garb playing vampire is going to excite a youth audience. It's going to bring in teenagers. It's going to get the attention of younger people who in the 80s are a little bit more free in how they spend their time and money. Because by the time we hit the 80s, in the United States especially, we're looking at two-income households being a regular thing. Mom has to work. So no longer is it going to be that 15-year-old Johnny's media consumption, it can't be watched quite as easily. And so there's opportunities to play to children, to market to young people in a way that we haven't seen previously. And so on the one hand, you want to make something that 15-year-old Johnny's going to get excited about. On the other hand, you want to make something that people are going to be trepidatious about. I mean, because they don't, especially older generations, they're going to see 15-year-old Johnny as a threat. So, I mean, that vampire being, that youthful vampire being the bad guy, that actually fits for them. That fits for that motif. Because Johnny's grandparents are watching him grow up in a world where, mom and dad are both working, or heaven forbid, they might be divorced. And Johnny's a latchkey kid and part of this new kind of Gen X that is feeling alienated, unwanted, undesired, and lashing out as a result. At the same time, in the 80s and 90s, you have a resurgence of a sexually transmitted infection epidemic. I mean, we've got cures for gonorrhea, chlamydia, and syphilis now. We've got treatments available, but HIV and AIDS are creating panic everywhere, both in the gay community, where people are experiencing rapid proliferation of the disease and really no acknowledgement from any kind of authority or leadership that could help them out of the situation. And then you have kind of the conservative community as well that is kind of turning on the gay community and looking at them as pariahs in that, they have, not only do they have their sinful ways, but they have this awful disease on top of it. And into this conversation, the vampire reemerges, this time directed by authors like Billy Martin under the name Poppy Z. Bright, and of course, the big name Anne Rice. The vampire comes back in a much sexier way this time. These authors of kind of the new Gothic fiction aren't afraid to be hypersexual and bisexual or pansexual with their vampires. And in fact, they encourage that kind of behavior in themselves and other authors. It's a new kind of titillation, but it's also freeing. It is an opportunity to talk about sex in new ways. At the same time, and I would say you more specifically see this with works by authors like Billy Martin under the pseudonym Poppy Z. Bright, you see direct discussion of HIV and AIDS in its time, in its context, and unabashed approaches to the situation. I was quite surprised and intrigued when I recently went back and reread some Billy Martin works, or read some Billy Martin works, I should say, for the first time, and found heroes struggling with HIV and AIDS in a way that definitely spoke to the 80s and 90s conceptions of them. It was kind of a trip because, of course, I had the benefit of education that spanned beyond where we were in the 80s and 90s in our understanding of the disease. But it was absolutely fascinating. It was like looking at an archaeological record of where we'd come from in terms of our knowledge there. And so finally, fast forward to the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, and we've got Twilight, a very divisive take on the vampire. Love it or hate it, what I think that Twilight shows is that Dracula is getting younger and sexier over the century. And finally he reaches kind of peak form as a glowing teenager. And I find that particularly remarkable. Again, I think Twilight mostly speaks to the idea of youth culture and of the threat and anxiety surrounding youth culture and parents, especially in that kind of that post-80s, post-90s environment, maybe even going into kind of that early war on terror era. And Twilight even trying on some level to recognize some things that better popular culture will do a more serious job with in the next 20 years or so. After Twilight, there's a bit of a backlash. The nature of Twilight is such that it kind of turns the vampire on its head, and it gives people very oppositional perspectives on the vampire. And so maybe we kind of have a little bit of a retraction of the vampire. The vampire goes back into the dark a little bit. But I think also the other thing that happens is a return to form, a return to the monster. And I mean, the immediate example, it's definitely not, an immediate backlash to Twilight, but I think about like The Last Voyage of the Demeter. I think that's a great example of the return to the monster approach to the vampire. It's kind of a fragmentation that we're seeing here. The vampire goes lots of different directions after this. And we also see some great parody emerge in the whole kind of what we do in the shadows film and television. So the vampire can become sort of a figure of humor in that space. There are two pieces of media at present that are showing us the vampire continues to have his undead fingers on the pulse of our societal cognitive dissonance and our struggles to tell the untellable. The first of these is a film. It's well known, Ryan Coogler's Sinners. This is a utilization of both the vampire and an expert exploration of America's past in order to talk about America's present. And you can't really talk about the United States present without going into the past and looking at all of the racial issues that were hidden, the ones that were concealed. The United States is particularly good at covering up the family business and not talking about it. And if you grow up in the American educational system, it's likely that you don't hear a lot about racial discrimination. You don't hear a lot about the realities of life before the civil rights movement in the United States. And so Sinners explores that history, or part of that history, expertly, with a very true-to-life portrayal of segregated society in Mississippi. And then on top of that adds the vampire as kind of a catharsis. I mean, it's one thing to have a historical documentary, to discuss history, to even have kind of a historical drama. But there's a tension release, a blow-up that occurs when you add in a supernatural component. And Sinners does this expertly as well. And you end up with this kind of, well, very valuable message to people today. At least I found it very valuable. Because we don't get to choose the times that we're born into, and we don't get to choose the social struggles that we're born into, and the social struggles that play out while we're alive. But these are the days, the months, the years that we are given. And so we have to find joy even amidst the chaos and the suffering and the blood and the horror. And I think Sinners does that expertly. Now, the second piece I want to discuss is called Buffalo Hunter Hunter. It's a book. I mean, I think it would make a wonderful movie or any other kind of like media project, but I mean, time will tell with that. Stephen Graham Jones, the author, is quickly becoming a household name in terms of horror literature and horror fiction. He is presenting some interesting ideas as kind of growing up a horror fan, and he's also presenting some ideas about Native heritage that are definitely worth exploring, and I'm glad to see them explored. I'm excited to see them explored, honestly. I was excited to get a hold of Buffalo Hunter Hunter and go through it. And, I mean, even if I found the story difficult at times, I was overall appreciative. I was appreciative of the narrative. I was appreciative of the historical context, the historical structure around the narrative. Graham Jones takes some kind of, just in general, his pacing with certain things and kind of surprises he throws in. They kind of throw me for a loop. It's a fun way to be thrown sometimes, but it does take things, he does take things in directions that you're not expecting, which, I mean, that's, what you're allowed to do as a horror author. And I mean, I can't say that there were definitely some moments reading that book where I did get like a little chill, even if I didn't like where things were going, or even if I thought the story was progressing in an odd direction. And more importantly, it is a story that focuses on Native perspective, allows Native perspective to be presented, allows Native characters to have depth. I mean, I think one complaint that you see off and on, and I mean, I definitely feel this about queer characters, is that when you're presenting kind of your culture, your space, your world, and your people, you have a tendency to want to present them in as favorable a light as possible. And so everybody's pressed and dressed, and you get this very kind of spit polish approach to the culture and the cultural group. And that doesn't necessarily work for horror. Horror characters, morality is tangly, and they can have depth in a way that you don't get with some other characters. And what I really love about Stephen Graham Jones is that, he was not afraid to portray a native figure as having kind of a villainous conflict in him. I mean, we can talk about whether the central character is kind of the hero or not. But, I mean, definitely the central native character in Buffalo Hunter Hunter Goodstab, I mean, he does good and bad things. He's a complex character. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. And also, it was just an opportunity to really air some of the anger and frustration related to native culture, native politics, and presented in a way that could be absorbed and digested by someone outside the community. And I feel like I learned things from Buffalo Hunter Hunter. Not just about history, which is often where native peoples get placed in American education, but in present context, in kind of present understanding of where these folks are emotionally and what kinds of cognitive dissonance and emotions they're experiencing. On top of that, just one final point regarding Buffalo Hunter Hunter that I think it's relevant to role players, and we're transferring now to kind of the TTRPG discussion in this podcast. Buffalo Hunter Hunter, if you ever intend to play a gangrel in a campaign of Vampire the Masquerade or Vampire the Masquerade Chronicle, you absolutely need to read Buffalo Hunter Hunter ahead of time, because I think the way Graham Jones relates the idea of the animal and the vampire it's very striking. It is very unique, and also, I mean, it kind of portrays the vampire in a parasitic fashion that it's unusual. I mean, the vampire as parasite is definitely a trope, but we don't see it quite like Graham Jones does it, where Graham Jones shows us that the vampire can not only be, a parasite in that feeding on blood, but also a cultural parasite. And I just think that portrayal is fascinating. So in short, see Ryan Coogler's Sinners and read Stephen Graham Jones's Buffalo Hunter Hunter to look at some ways that the vampire is being used to address the cognitive dissonance surrounding contemporary issues of race and ethnicity. So time for a little TTRPG talk. And admittedly, what I'm going to discuss here, you can probably bring that across to writing or filmmaking or any other kind of creative pursuit involving the vampire that you like. But I'm going to talk about it in terms of TTRPGs because that's kind of where my artistic desires are rooted. So, how do we introduce a vampire at the gaming table in a way that lets us negotiate this obstacle of the vampire being a known quantity? I mean, everybody's seen Dracula at this point. Probably people have seen more than one version of it, or kind of different styles of it, different vampire movies. There's lots of different vampire films out there, and television shows, media, all sorts of things. So the reality is that your players are saturated. They know what a vampire is, and as soon as you introduce one into the gaming space, they're going to start trying to piece it together from their perspective, which is consumers of vampire media. They're going to be kind of poking at it, trying to figure out, okay, what are its abilities? What are its capacities? How do I stop it? What kind of vampire is this? Is this, a Dracula vampire? Is it a Buffy the Vampire Slayer vampire? Is it 30 Days of Night? Where am I, what am I looking at here? And how can I use my knowledge of popular culture to give me an edge? Because that's naturally kind of how players are going to think. They're going to try and out-strategize you on their vampire knowledge, or using their vampire knowledge. And what I want to look at are some broad storytelling ideas where you can approach vampires in your games and move away from kind of that confrontational, how do I use my knowledge to defeat it, and instead invite the players to hear the story out and to be part of it. So the first strategy I would suggest is to lean in. It's kind of the obvious one, or kind of an obvious dichotomy. We'll talk about the second option momentarily, but let's stick with the first one for now. Lean in. Yes, vampires are well known in popular culture. Yes, everybody knows about Dracula, knows about stakes through the heart, knows about garlic, knows about mirrors. And even the vampire, to a degree, is aware of this, and my goodness, are they annoyed by the realities of their condition. This is a tactic called lampshading. TVTropes.org defines lampshade hanging, or more informally lampshading, as a writer's trick of dealing with any element of the story that seems too dubious to take at face value, whether a very implausible plot development or a particularly blatant use of a trope, by calling attention to it and simply moving on. This assures the audience that the author is aware of the implausible plot development that just happened, and that they aren't trying to slip something past the audience. It also assures the audience that the world of the story is like real life. What's implausible for you is just as implausible for these characters, and just as likely to provoke an incredulous response. And so this is kind of an opportunity for you to break the fourth wall without breaking the fourth wall. Give the vampire an opportunity to roll his eyes in turn as the players roll theirs, and express annoyance at the situation. Yeah, I'm a Romanian vampire, Dracula, blah, blah, blah. Let it have kind of its moment of catharsis before the players dive in with the garlic and the holy water and the wooden stakes. Alternatively, you could dress this up in a lot of different ways. Lampshading can be with really any kind of vampire that's been available in popular culture. You could talk about the goth girl that was the worst Tinder date ever and wouldn't stay away from biting your neck the entire time. And gosh, she had weird dreams and didn't sleep all that well. And with this, you can play into those tropes, whether they're going to be the more classic kind of Dracula tropes, or you can play into the kind of what I see as the vampire revival, the modern goth movement, and everything that it entails. And just you can kind of wink and nod and have fun with it. But it doesn't just have to be fun. You can also use lampshading as an opportunity to world build. And here's what I mean. Let's take an example game like Cult Divinity Lost. Okay, Cult Divinity Lost is this Gnostic horror game about dark cities and illusions that trap people in them, and angels and demons that are conspiring against human beings. But the idea is to present this information slowly to your players so that they don't absorb it all at once, so they don't figure it all out at once, and also so they can have a bit of fun learning about the world. So let's say I throw a dyed-in-the-wool vampire into a Cult Divinity Lost game. This is a creature that is either cursed by God or the servant of the devil, or possibly both. So if this is a creature that is cursed by God or the servant of the devil, that means God and the devil exist in this world, and you've now built that in and let your players know that, okay, this is a world with a religious structure to it. This is a world of monotheistic kind of hierarchy, and what does that mean? Should I be on the lookout for angels? Should I be on the lookout for demons? It kind of, you can expand using lamp shading as your baseline. Now, like I mentioned before, you can take an oppositional approach to lamp shading. You don't have to lean in, you can lean away. And I like this strategy for its own reason. Basically, you take the vampire idea, but you throw off the narrative. You throw off the structure. So the vampire normally comes in as this very suave, sophisticated, edgy, good-looking man or woman, an incubus, a succubus type figure. But we don't have to do it that way. We can still have a vampiric creature in a game without having to follow all of the structure, all of the popular framework that's hung on the vampire as a concept. We can make our inhuman monster cute and cuddly instead. Good example of this tactic, I saw it in, it was on a Doctor Who Christmas special a couple years ago, a creature called the Meep, that was essentially this cute and adorable kind of, it was bigger, but it reminded me of Gizmo from the Gremlins. And it turned out to be a rampaging, genocidal, maniac, authoritarian dictator type creature. But it was contained in this cute body. So it was a very kind of, appearances can be deceiving. And I think we could utilize that in our games. There's certainly a lot of kind of cute, chibi ideas out there that we could, cut open and insert a monster into in order to make some entertainment. A lot of people right now are obsessed with the cuteness of things like kawakas and baby pygmy hippos and capybaras. And I just think it would be interesting to flip the script there and put a vampiric, blood-sucking, flesh-eating monstrosity inside of one of these creatures. Maybe it is the creature, maybe it's a parasitic attachment to the creature somehow, but to have that kind of, to lean away from the typical vampire trope and instead make the cute, cuddly, most kitten-like thing the most dangerous thing in the game, and then let it run free and see what happens. The other thing you could do is you could take some of those those kind of cultural frameworks that are hung on the vampire, and you could swap them around a little bit. The idea of the vampire as the suave foreigner, for example, you could turn that on its head. You could make the vampire the local, the native, the everyday, and have the foreigner be the victim in this case. And for some reason, I'm kind of picturing a very contemporary idea where the vampire is like a landlord over an immigrant community. Or, even an ICE agent or something like that. You could get really dark with this and really contemporary, really of its moment if you want, using this idea. Alternatively, you could flip the script where looks are concerned. Vampires, normally very sexy creatures, but you could do something similar to I don't know, there's a character in What We Do in the Shadows, the TV show, that's kind of an accountant that's an energy vampire. I'm not overly familiar with the show, but or like an office worker. But essentially you take the vampire out of, the suave, tall, sexy, long-haired goth guy, and you stick him in the short, balding, acne-spotted loser. And you allow that to play out. A third option is that you could kind of combine these two ideas, lean in and lean away at the same time. And I tend to think of this as the self-aware vampire. The vampire that is aware of its own mythos sufficiently that it can use the fictionalized nature of that mythos against its prey, against its adversaries. And so this could be an example of a horror scenario that involves a film about a vampire. And there is a vampire hiding in plain sight, either among the cast or the crew, utilizing the elements of the film in order to conceal itself. At the same time, you could have like a vampire show up at a fan club for particular vampire media, or even have a vampire turn up in a LARP and utilize those structures as a way of hiding itself. You could also play with mythos, because just because there are vampires doesn't mean that it's strictly the Dracula mythos that is dominant. You could have a situation where you're utilizing something like the Cthulhu mythos, but you play the vampire into it. And you could do this a couple of different ways. The first thing is that you could utilize vampire folklore as a way to completely conceal the true nature of an adversary. A Cthulhu mythos creature like a sorcerer, a ghoul, a Migo, a member of the great race of Yith. These things, because of the way they work, could easily be mistaken for vampires. And so you could kind of get a vampire feeling going in a scenario in order to conceal an underlying threat. And then you've kind of double faked at that point, because on the one hand, you've given a very obvious "this is a vampire" scenario to your gamers, or to your players. But on the other hand, you're also concealing something that they may be familiar with. Your players might have faced ghouls or Migo in dozens of scenarios at this point. So having a way to mask them a little bit better might end up being an entertaining experience. You could also differentiate by having this mask of folklore be something intentional. Creatures like ghouls, for example, notorious when it comes to pulling pranks and making fun of humanity, really holding up the mirror to humankind, could easily take something like vampire folklore and run with it to the point that it gets really bloody and nasty. And then finally, you could also take the opposite approach. You could establish a game with a vampire and vampire hunter mythos, and you've got you're basically like your team from Blade or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and they got their stakes loaded and ready to go out. And then they accidentally discover that's not the world they're in. They're in the Cthulhu mythos. And so they have to contend with having armed themselves with knowledge and weapons to fight a folkloric creature that doesn't exist, but there is something awful out there. And it very definitely needs to be fought. But now it's not a hunt kind of it's not a hunting the vampire situation. Now they're scrambling, trying to figure out how to deal with this otherworldly entity that is just as dangerous as the thing they thought existed, but is something entirely different and has a completely different rule set. Another tack you can take is to bring the vampire into your gaming space but focus less on the text of the vampire, the Dracula, the goth vampire, whatever they look like. Focus less on that aspect and more on the texture of the vampire. And specifically, what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking of the texture of the vampire is I'm thinking about the symbolic qualities of the vampire. Think about, what the vampire means, what it's trying to represent, and you play into that. So we've already discussed the fact that vampires are great for representing these untellable and uncomfortable and cognitively dissonant ideas. The example that comes easiest to mind for this is to play into the disease element of the vampire. Play into that notion that vampire equals disease. And then with that, you texture and you flavor your scenario with a vampire crisis that plays upon the fear of infection and the body horror associated with it. First thing, of course, in a situation like this, you probably want to decide whether your disease is going to be naturally occurring on planet Earth, or if it's going to be, something extraterrestrial, or maybe even something spiritual. And that's going to give you kind of a layer of world building to work with. And so once you've got that decision made, from there it's about kind of peppering it into the story and figuring out what you want to say, whether it's about something cultural related to disease, or if you want to say something that's more about the horror of the experience of disease. You could go either direction here. I mean, you could easily do the Billy Martin, Poppy Z. Bright route and put the vampire into a non-heteronormative space and create a conversation about STIs or HIV/AIDS that may be relevant, that may be meaningful to your gaming group, and also uncomfortable at the same time. If you want to stretch it out from there, maybe, and don't want to use something as visceral as HIV/AIDS, and maybe, but still talk about disease, the Laundry Files book, The Rhesus Chart, is a good example of playing up the disease of vampirism, where the particular vampires in the Laundry series kind of mirror a kuru or a bovine spongiform type disease. Then you've got the actual factor that vampires drink blood, and blood is used as a transmission mechanism for vampirism. And that gets into all sorts of medical and kind of human ick factors that you could play with. I mean, there's nothing that's going to set somebody off quite like the idea of a monster or even another human being coming at their character with a syringe full of infected blood. That's definitely going to play up discomfort and allow you to experience some visceral feelings at the gaming table, even though you're kind of disconnected from them. And we can also talk about, I think, within this context, I mean, maybe it's not a body horror thing necessarily, but the idea that a vampire feeding from you can cause a loss of will. And so it's not a body horror thing, more of a brain horror, the thing that your thoughts might not be your own. You can play with that idea. You can use that as a way to turn a vampire gaming experience into kind of a psychological sanity-rending experience for the player and player characters. Another way you can play with the vampire is to alter its dietary requirements. And this might be a good way to throw players off the scent, or alternatively have a different conversation than the one that's inspired by blood, disease, etc. There are a lot of different fluids out there that vampires could be interested in feeding on. Spinal fluid, fat and oil, sugar, salt, water, sexual fluids. And then there's these more kind of ephemeral ideas that maybe aren't something biological, but the vampire could still drain, things like energy or magic points or the capacity for psychic power. All of these are things that a vampire could feed on, and as a result, you end up telling a different story in the process. In addition to playing with the texture of the vampire, you could also play with its context a little bit. And by this, I'm thinking inserting the vampire not into a framework of either spiritual kind of good and evil battling or something cosmic like the Cthulhu mythos. But you could drop the vampire into a fringe aspect of modern political debate. And by this, what I mean is the two examples that really come to mind here are you could insert the vampire into a narrative that is focused on the satanic panic of the 1980s and 90s. I think that could create a very interesting story. Or alternatively, you could bring it up to date and insert the vampire into QAnon. I think both of these are places where the vampire could be utilized as a tool of telling the untellable at the gaming table. I'll give you one example here. This was something that I came across as part of my research for my scenario, Somebody Think of the Children. And it's the Springfield vampire tunnels. Now, they're not actually tunnels that have vampires in them, but in Springfield, Missouri, there are these tunnels under the city that were built back in the 20s as a means of avoiding flooding. Basically, Springfield, Missouri would get flooded regularly, and it would be a filthy mess, so the town council constructed this network of tunnels underneath the downtown, where the floodwaters would end up going, and the downtown would be spared this kind of annual process of having this disgusting flood take place. Fast forward, Springfield, Missouri is a modern city and has other mechanisms for dealing with flooding. Not to mention, just because of climate change, the rain quantity is different. But the Springfield vampire tunnels still exist, and they are this series of tunnels that are graffitied, that are often inhabited by the disenfranchised, the unhoused, the politically radical, the mentally ill, and teenage curiosity seekers, or alternatively urban explorers who just kind of want kind of a tourism adventure in the underground. But as a result, you end up compartmentalizing all of these groups and kind of putting them under the city. And so I think there's an interesting opportunity to explore the political nature of these groups within the context of something like the Satanic Panic or QAnon, while at the same time potentially having a vampire horror scenario. I'm going to end on a particularly dark note here, just because I think it fits a podcast focused on the vampire, but also because I kind of want this one to have emphasis, and I want people listening to this to kind of think about it a little bit, because I definitely have, and it's kept me up nights. So all this time, we've been talking about the vampire as a supernatural creature. And, we've been kind of pulling and changing different aspects of it, but the vampire's been supernatural the whole time. And I want to suggest that a very dark place you could go to that would make for a very interesting game would be to look at the idea of the vampire being human. Not a supernatural creature at all, but a human being doing human evil. Because if anything, that we're kind of taking a layer away from the vampire and allowing the evil that the vampire represents to be that much closer to us. When we create cosmologies and folklore that contains the supernatural, it's a way of creating a buffer between us and the thing that makes us uncomfortable. If that thing is just another human being, well, that could be anybody. That could be somebody sitting at the gaming table. And I think that that's an unsettling notion and one that's worth exploring in a mature and experienced role-playing group. You could do this in a couple of different ways, as far as I see it. You could work with kind of the Renfield syndrome idea. Now, this is not an actual disease. It might have been in an early issue of the DSM, but I can't say that verifiably. I'm not overly experienced with that aspect of mental health, kind of the history of psychological disorder. But the idea of Renfield syndrome is essentially you have a human being who, because they are mentally disturbed or traumatized in some way, they think they are a vampire. And so they live like a vampire, or they live how they think a vampire should live. And as a result, they do harm to people and communities. This would be kind of a lone vampire scenario, kind of the player characters versus a lone adversary. And I mean, you could even spice it up by adding questions as to whether or not this person has supernatural powers. And then at the end, pull the mask off and find that it's just an ordinary person. It could be just like anybody else. It was just somebody who had a bad day. If you want something more akin to your players versus a group of adversaries, then you could arrange the vampire, the human vampire, as a cult leader. And for this, you could particularly turn to the true crime story of the Kentucky vampire killings. This was another kind of element that went into Somebody Think of the Children. But it's a particularly gruesome story about power and control and latchkey kids that ended up killing a couple people. All in service of a group of teenagers collectively understanding themselves as vampires, and in particular understanding an older teenager as a vampire who was going to grant them immortality and a life of dark pleasures and all that they could ever want. And so on the one hand, you kind of have the vampire set dressing. On the other hand, you have the fact that cults come down to power over sex and money. And these are the factors that make up a cult. This is ultimately what the entire purpose is about, not drinking blood or anything like that, not believing you're a vampire, but simply power and control of one human being over another. Lastly, you could take any number of the cannibal tropes that are out there and just alter them to fit kind of a liquid diet rather than the more traditional kind of Texas Chainsaw Massacre butcher shop arrangement. Instead, you've kind of got blood as the central factor there. And I mean, the vampire may be an expression of this idea, or it may be a factor symbolically in the cannibal trope. I mean, in the end, vampire can just be an adjective. This is maybe an extra final thought, kind of a PS on the end of things here. But you can just make vampire an adjective in order to spice something up. It's particularly effective if you're trying to mimic B-movie horror or exploitation film. I mean, I'll just off the top of my head say that if I gave you two scenario titles, if I gave you Killer Sex Clowns from Saturn, but then I gave you Vampire Sex Clowns from Saturn, I mean, these would be two distinctly different scenarios. How they play out is up to you because, I mean, they're just words as far as I'm concerned that I'm throwing together. But because we've added vampire into one of them, it automatically changes what we're looking at. To conclude, the vampire is an elastic monster that wears a human face. Its elastic qualities mean that the vampire gives you plenty of lore to play with, and you can pick and choose. I think the one thing is the one sort of danger in all of it is trying to include everything. If I had any advice to GMs looking to forge their own path with the vampire, I would say don't be afraid to cut things out. I mean, keep in mind that just because vampire folklore represents vampires in a certain way doesn't mean you need to have your vampires represented in that way. Folklore is full of variation, it's full of lies, and people get things wrong all the time. So there's no need to include everything that you know about vampires into a vampire story in order to make it effective. In fact, the opposite may be beneficial, because then you can focus on getting that elastic vampire, that real kind of monster mask, around the symbolic topic that you actually want to discuss, or the themes of the scenario that you want to bring forward. Thank you for listening to the Delapore Media Podcast. You can find a variety of horror gaming resources at www.delapore.media. That's Delapore spelled Delapore. Delapore Media, toward verisimilitude in tabletop role-playing. Take care. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Somebody Think of the Children, a suburban horror scenario where moms take on the Cthulhu mythos. Available for the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, and now available at a steep discount at TTRPG. Check out the discount link in the show notes.